In a quiet suburban neighborhood of Ridgewood Heights, the stately home of the Andrews family stood as a symbol of stability and success. Its elegant brick facade and manicured lawn masked the turmoil that had brewed behind closed doors. But one fateful summer evening, the tranquility of this picture-perfect community was shattered. Emergency responders arrived to a chaotic scene. A middle-aged woman, frantic and tearful, standing in the driveway, pointing to a lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor. The man was identified as Daniel Andrews, the younger brother of the late Thomas Andrews, a beloved local businessman who had died 2 years earlier in a tragic accident. Daniel's death was not an accident. It was murder. The story that unfolded would shock everyone who knew the Andrews family. At the center of the chaos was Margaret Andrews, Thomas's widow, who had found solace in Daniel after her husband's death. What began as a bond of shared grief spiraled into obsession, jealousy, and betrayal, culminating in a deadly confrontation that left one man dead and another woman fighting to defend her actions. What drove Margaret to this breaking point, and what secrets were uncovered that turned a story of grief into one of tragedy? This is the chilling tale of how a widow's obsession with her late husband's brother spiraled out of control and ended in a deadly crime that no one saw coming. The story begins in the quiet, affluent suburb of Ridgewood Heights, a picturesque neighborhood where the streets are lined with towering oak trees, and every house boasts pristine lawns and a sense of understated luxury. Among these homes stood the Andrews family residence, a stately brick house that had long been a cornerstone of the community. The Andrews family was well known in Ridgewood Heights. Thomas Andrews, the patriarch, had been a successful entrepreneur who built a thriving real estate business from the ground up. He was admired for his leadership and generosity, often sponsoring local events and charities. His sudden death in a car accident 2 years prior had left a void in the community and his family devastated. Thomas's widow, Margaret Andrews, was a striking woman in her early 50s. Known for her elegance and poise, Margaret had struggled to adjust to life without her husband. Despite her attempts to maintain her social commitments and run the family business, those close to her noticed a change. She seemed withdrawn, her once vibrant energy replaced by a quiet sadness. Grief counseling and support groups became part of her routine, but her pain lingered. Margaret's closest source of support came from an unexpected place: Daniel Andrews, Thomas's younger brother. In his mid-40s, Daniel was everything his brother was not. While Thomas was structured and ambitious, Daniel was free-spirited and unconventional. A freelance photographer, he had spent much of his life traveling the world, rarely staying in one place for long. Yet, after Thomas's death, Daniel moved back to Ridgewood Heights, vowing to help Margaret and her teenage son, Lucas, rebuild their lives. What began as a supportive relationship between Margaret and Daniel slowly evolved into something more. Friends noticed how often Daniel visited the Andrews home, helping with repairs or keeping Margaret company during her lonelier moments. The two grew closer, sharing memories of Thomas and bonding over their mutual grief. At first, it seemed like a natural connection, but as time passed, their closeness became the subject of whispers among neighbors. Lucas, now 17, was initially grateful for his uncle's presence. Daniel seemed to fill a void, offering companionship and stability his mother desperately needed. But as Lucas watched the dynamic between Margaret and Daniel shift, he began to sense something wasn't right. The lines between family and something more began to blur, creating an unspoken tension that would soon spiral out of control. By the summer of 2023, what had once been a source of comfort for Margaret became a dangerous obsession. And as tensions mounted within the Andrews household, the idyllic facade of Ridgewood Heights masked the storm brewing behind closed doors, one that would soon erupt in tragedy. It was a warm summer evening in July 2023 when the tranquility of Ridgewood Heights was shattered. Neighbors later recalled the Andrews home appearing perfectly ordinary that night, lights glowing softly in the windows, the sound of muffled voices carrying into the quiet suburban air. But inside, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Margaret Andrews had invited Daniel Andrews over for dinner, as she often did. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a typical family gathering. The dining table was set meticulously, a habit Margaret had maintained since Thomas's death. The evening began uneventfully, with casual conversation and wine flowing freely. Lucas, Margaret's teenage son, had chosen to eat upstairs in his room, leaving the two adults alone. As the evening progressed, the mood began to shift. Margaret, emboldened by alcohol and her growing obsession, brought up a conversation she had avoided for weeks. She confessed her feelings to Daniel, urging him to consider a future with her. "Thomas is gone," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't have to hide anymore. We can be together." Daniel, visibly uncomfortable, tried to defuse the situation. He reminded Margaret that their bond was rooted in their shared grief for Thomas, and that pursuing anything beyond that would betray his memory. His rejection only fueled Margaret's frustration. Her voice grew louder, more insistent, accusing Daniel of leading her on. "You've been here every day, comforting me, supporting me. Don't act like you don't feel it too," she shouted. Unbeknownst to them, Lucas had come downstairs drawn by the escalating argument. He stood in the hallway, out of sight, listening to the exchange. What he heard horrified him. The idea that his mother could harbor romantic feelings for his uncle was a betrayal he hadn't imagined. He burst into the room, his face flushed with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The confrontation spiraled out of control. Lucas accused Margaret and Daniel of disrespecting his father's memory, his voice cracking with emotion. Margaret tried to calm him down, but her attempts only seemed to escalate the situation. Daniel, caught in the middle, attempted to mediate. "Lucas, this isn't what it looks like," he insisted, but the tension in the room was palpable. Then came the breaking point. Margaret, desperate to regain control of the situation, turned on Daniel, accusing him of manipulating her feelings and abandoning her when she needed him most. Her words were sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. "You're just like everyone else," she said. "You've left me alone, just like Thomas did." Daniel, realizing the conversation was spiraling beyond repair, decided to leave. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the front door. Margaret followed, pleading with him not to go. But as he reached for the door handle, Lucas, still seething with rage, stepped between them. "You're not leaving until we figure this out," he said, his tone a mix of anger and desperation. In the heat of the moment, Margaret reached for a decorative vase on a nearby table. Her hands trembled as she held it, her emotions overwhelming her. She screamed at Daniel, her voice cracking with anguish, and hurled the vase in his direction. The vase shattered against the wall, missing Daniel but startling everyone in the room. The chaos reached its climax when Margaret, in a sudden burst of rage, grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. "You don't get to leave me like this," she screamed. Lucas lunged to stop her, but it was too late. In the scuffle that followed, Daniel was fatally wounded. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest as blood pooled beneath him. Margaret froze, the knife slipping from her hands. The room fell silent except for Lucas's panicked breathing. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Daniel, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. Daniel Andrews was gone. Lucas, driven by shock and instinct, called 911. When first responders arrived, they found Margaret in a daze, sitting beside Daniel's lifeless body. The knife lay on the floor, a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted in what should have been a safe haven. Lucas stood nearby, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. The once pristine Andrews home was now a crime scene, marked by blood and broken glass. As officers began their investigation, neighbors gathered outside, murmuring in hushed tones about the tragedy that had unfolded in their seemingly perfect community. The idyllic streets of Ridgewood Heights would never feel the same again. The investigation into the death of Daniel Andrews began immediately, with detectives piecing together the events of that fateful evening. By the time officers arrived at the Andrews residence, the scene was tense and chaotic. Margaret Andrews sat on the floor, her hands stained with blood, muttering incoherently. Lucas Andrews, pale and visibly shaken, provided a fragmented account of what had happened. Leading the case was Detective Sarah Brenner, a seasoned investigator known for her methodical approach. As she surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes took in the shattered vase, the blood-stained knife on the floor, and the distraught expressions of the two remaining members of the Andrews household. Detective Brenner knew this wasn't a simple case of self-defense or an accidental altercation. Something deeper was at play. The initial accounts were conflicting. Margaret claimed the situation spiraled out of control after an argument, insisting she hadn't intended to harm Daniel. "It was an accident," she said repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Lucas, however, painted a more volatile picture. He described the escalating tensions, his mother's erratic behavior, and her growing obsession with Daniel. She wasn't in her right mind, Lucas told investigators. She thought they were meant to be together. Detectives began by collecting physical evidence. The kitchen knife, identified as the murder weapon, bore Margaret's fingerprints. The shattered vase and the overturned furniture told a story of a heated struggle, corroborating Lucas's description of the chaos. Blood patterns on the floor and walls confirmed the violent nature of the confrontation. The autopsy report revealed that Daniel had died from a single stab wound to the chest, striking a vital artery. The force and angle of the wound suggested an act of rage rather than a calculated or defensive maneuver. This detail raised questions about Margaret's claim of accidental harm, hinting at a more intentional act. Detective Brenner turned her attention to the dynamics within the Andrews household, conducting interviews with friends, neighbors, and colleagues. A pattern of concerning behavior began to emerge. Neighbors recounted seeing Daniel visit Margaret frequently over the past year, their interactions often appearing friendly, but occasionally tense. "We thought he was just helping her through a tough time," one neighbor remarked. But there was something off about how close they were. Colleagues of Daniel described him as a compassionate but private man who had stepped in to support Margaret and Lucas after his brother's death. However, one co-worker revealed that Daniel had confided in her about feeling overwhelmed by Margaret's increasing dependence on him. He said he was trying to help her, but she was becoming too attached, the co-worker explained. He didn't want to hurt her feelings, but he felt trapped. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives uncovered text messages and emails exchanged between Margaret and Daniel. The messages revealed a complex relationship, one that started as a bond of mutual grief but evolved into something more complicated. Margaret's messages often expressed affection and longing, while Daniel's responses were polite but distant, indicating his discomfort with her advances. One text from Margaret, sent just days before the incident, stood out. "You're the only one who understands me. I don't know what I'd do without you. Please don't push me away." In contrast, Daniel's reply read, "Margaret, we need to set boundaries. This isn't healthy for either of us." Lucas's testimony provided further context. He admitted he had noticed his mother's growing obsession with Daniel but hadn't realized the extent of it until that night. "She talked about him all the time," Lucas said. "She even started comparing him to my dad, saying how much better he understood her. It was like she couldn't see how uncomfortable he was." Detectives also discovered Margaret's personal journal, which offered chilling insights into her state of mind. In one entry, she wrote, "Daniel is my lifeline. Without him, I have nothing. I know he feels it too, even if he won't admit it. He's just scared. I have to show him it's okay to love me." These words painted a picture of a woman consumed by her emotions, unable to distinguish between reality and her own desires. Further investigation revealed that Daniel had planned to distance himself from Margaret in the weeks leading up to the wedding. He had confided in a friend about his intention to travel for work, hoping the separation would help her move on. This revelation added weight to the theory that Margaret's actions were driven by desperation and fear of abandonment. Detective Brenner also focused on Lucas's role in the events. His account of the incident was detailed and consistent, but investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that his presence during the altercation may have influenced the outcome. Did he intervene in a way that escalated the violence? Or was he simply a horrified witness to a tragedy he couldn't prevent? The evidence was damning, but it also painted a complex picture. Margaret's actions were clearly intentional in the heat of the moment, but her emotional state and the circumstances leading up to the crime suggested a deeper, psychological unraveling. As the case moved toward trial, the question remained. Was this an act of cold-blooded murder, or the desperate act of a woman driven to the edge by her own grief and obsession? As the case against Margaret Andrews seemed to solidify, a shocking revelation during the investigation threatened to upend the entire narrative. Just days before the trial was set to begin, Detective Sarah Brenner received an anonymous tip that pointed to a hidden connection between Margaret and another individual, Vanessa Moore, Daniel's former girlfriend. Vanessa, who had dated Daniel years before his return to Ridgewood Heights, had no apparent ties to the Andrews family. However, the tip suggested that Vanessa and Margaret had been in contact in the weeks leading up to the incident. Subpoenas for Margaret's phone records confirmed that the two women had exchanged multiple phone calls and text messages, a detail Margaret had failed to disclose during her initial interviews. Detectives tracked down Vanessa, who reluctantly agreed to an interview. Her account shed light on a disturbing new angle. Vanessa revealed that Margaret had reached out to her, claiming she needed closure about Daniel's past relationships to better understand his hesitance to commit. "At first, I thought she just wanted to know more about him," Vanessa explained. "But the way she talked, it was obsessive. She kept asking if Daniel had ever talked about her, if he had compared us." Vanessa admitted that she had felt uneasy about the conversations but hadn't thought much of it until the news of Daniel's death broke. "She kept implying that Daniel was hiding something from her," Vanessa said. "She even asked if I thought he'd ever cheated on me or if he was capable of betrayal. It was like she was trying to justify something." The revelation of Margaret's communication with Vanessa added a chilling layer to the case. It suggested that Margaret's actions on the night of the murder may not have been as impulsive as previously thought. Had Margaret been building a narrative in her mind, convincing herself that Daniel's reluctance was rooted in deceit rather than boundaries? The timeline of her conversations with Vanessa and her escalating obsession with Daniel pointed to a premeditated effort to manipulate the situation in her favor. Adding to the twist was a newly uncovered email exchange between Daniel and a close friend, sent just a week before his death. In the email, Daniel expressed concerns about Margaret's behavior. "She's been calling me at all hours, showing up unannounced. I tried to set boundaries, but she doesn't listen. I feel like she's losing her grip on reality. I'm not sure how to handle this without making things worse." The email provided insight into Daniel's mindset, confirming that he had recognized the danger but felt trapped in his role as Margaret's emotional anchor. He mentioned plans to leave Ridgewood Heights temporarily, hoping the distance would help Margaret regain perspective. But Margaret's journal entries, discovered earlier in the investigation, suggested she interpreted Daniel's actions as a betrayal, rather than an attempt to help. The final twist came when detectives re-examined the security footage from the Andrews home. Previously dismissed as routine, the footage from the week leading up to the incident revealed that Margaret had visited Daniel's home multiple times, often uninvited. On one occasion, she was seen pacing outside his door for nearly an hour before leaving without knocking. This behavior underscored the depth of her fixation and raised questions about whether her confrontation with Daniel on the night of the incident was truly spontaneous. The revelations reframed the narrative of the case. Margaret's insistence that the stabbing was an accident no longer aligned with the evidence of her calculated attempts to control and corner Daniel. The combination of her contact with Vanessa, her journal entries, and her behavior suggested that Margaret had been spiraling toward this tragic outcome for weeks, if not months. As the prosecution prepared to present these new findings at trial, the story of Daniel's death became even more complex. What initially appeared to be a crime of passion now hinted at a deeper, more unsettling truth. A pattern of obsession and manipulation that culminated in an act of violence Margaret may have convinced herself was inevitable. The twists left the community reeling, forcing everyone to confront the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions and blurred boundaries. The trial of Margaret Andrews began on a cold November morning, with media attention swirling around the courtroom. The tragic death of Daniel Andrews and the intricate web of obsession, betrayal, and manipulation that led to it had captivated the public. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense as the prosecution and defense prepared to argue their cases. The prosecution's strategy was clear: portray Margaret as a woman consumed by an unhealthy obsession with her late husband's brother, whose unreciprocated feelings led her to commit a premeditated act of violence. District Attorney Karen Blake opened with a stark recounting of the events leading up to the murder. She described Margaret's escalating behavior, her manipulative conversations with Vanessa Moore, and the damning evidence of her stalking Daniel in the days before the incident. "This was not an impulsive act," Blake stated. "It was the tragic culmination of an obsession that Margaret allowed to spiral out of control." The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The security footage showing Margaret pacing outside Daniel's home multiple times, her journal entries, and the text messages with Vanessa painted a picture of a woman struggling with rejection and desperate to regain control over her perceived relationship with Daniel. The footage of the Andrews home on the night of the murder was particularly damning, capturing the moments before the confrontation turned deadly. Jurors watched intently as the prosecutor replayed the harrowing events step by step. The most emotional testimony came from Lucas Andrews, Margaret's 17-year-old son. Lucas recounted the argument that had erupted on the night of the murder, describing how his mother's emotional instability had escalated into violence. "She wasn't thinking rationally," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "She thought Daniel had betrayed her, and she just lost control." Lucas's testimony was a double-edged sword. While it underscored Margaret's volatile state of mind, it also supported the prosecution's argument that her actions were intentional. The jury was left grappling with whether Margaret's mental state mitigated her culpability or highlighted her dangerous fixation. The defense, led by attorney Mark Hensley, argued that Margaret's actions were the result of a mental health crisis rather than calculated intent. Hensley painted a sympathetic picture of a grieving widow who had been overwhelmed by the emotional void left by her husband's death. He called upon a forensic psychologist who testified that Margaret was suffering from prolonged complicated grief disorder and obsessive-compulsive tendencies, which impaired her ability to process emotions and make rational decisions. The defense also highlighted Margaret's history of seeking help, including her attendance at grief counseling sessions and support groups. Hensley argued that Margaret's actions on the night of the incident were impulsive and driven by emotional instability rather than malice. "This was not a cold-blooded murder," he told the jury. "It was the tragic consequence of untreated grief and an emotional breakdown." However, the prosecution pushed back, emphasizing Margaret's ability to plan and manipulate despite her mental health struggles. They pointed to her calculated contact with Vanessa Moore and her persistent attempts to control Daniel's actions. "Margaret knew exactly what she was doing," Blake argued. "She may have been grieving, but her actions were deliberate and dangerous." The courtroom reached a pivotal moment when Vanessa Moore was called to testify. Vanessa's account of Margaret's persistent and invasive questioning further solidified the prosecution's case. Vanessa described feeling manipulated by Margaret's inquiries, saying, "She made it seem like she just wanted closure, but now I realize she was trying to justify her own actions." Margaret herself took the stand, a controversial decision by the defense. She appeared composed but emotional, addressing the jury with trembling hands. Margaret admitted to her feelings for Daniel, describing them as a misguided attempt to fill the void left by her husband's death. I thought he was my second chance," she said tearfully. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just didn't want to lose him, too." While her testimony garnered some sympathy, the prosecution's cross-examination was relentless. They pressed Margaret on the inconsistencies in her account, challenging her claim that the stabbing was accidental. When asked about her journal entries and text messages, Margaret struggled to explain the obsessive tone, further damaging her credibility. As the trial progressed, the jury was presented with two competing narratives. The prosecution portrayed Margaret as a manipulative and dangerous individual who refused to accept boundaries, ultimately resorting to violence when her fantasies were shattered. The defense argued that Margaret was a broken woman whose grief and untreated mental health issues clouded her judgment, leading to an impulsive act of violence. In her closing arguments, District Attorney Blake left the jury with a stark reminder of the consequences of Margaret's actions. "Daniel Andrews is gone," she said, her voice steady. "Not because of an accident, but because Margaret Andrews could not accept reality. Her choices, her actions, and her obsession led to his death." The defense, in their final statement, pleaded with the jury to consider Margaret's humanity. "She is not a monster," Hensley said. "She is a grieving widow who made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Show her the compassion she failed to show herself." After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Margaret Andrews was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. The judge acknowledged her emotional struggles but emphasized the need for accountability. As the gavel fell, the courtroom was silent. For Lucas, the outcome offered little solace. His family was irreparably broken, and his mother's obsession had cost him an uncle he admired. For the community of Ridgewood Heights, the trial was a sobering reminder of how unchecked emotions and unspoken grief could spiral into tragedy.